I'm Kim Van Alcamada, and I'm really excited to be teaching this class on setting the scene in historical fiction for the Adirondack Center for Writing. In this video, I'm just going to introduce how I'm going to approach the class and the different lessons that we'll be doing over the 5 weeks. So first of all, historical fiction. Why do we write it? Why do people read it? I write it because I love the research. I love setting a story in the past. For me, that sense of building a world and taking a reader someplace out of their contemporary experience is really exciting for me. I'm very interested in history, and I love seeing the little ways it connects to the present. I focus on early 20th century, so it's really not, compared to people who are doing like medieval stuff, it's really not that far away. To me, it seems extremely contemporary. In the 1920s, my grandmother, who I knew really, really well, she was born in 1918. So I almost feel like, okay, a person I knew really well who was alive was born in 1918. That's just not that much of a stretch for me. But I really love that time period. So you'll be thinking about the time periods you're writing about as the course goes on. And really, most of you are already really accomplished. You have a lot of experience. Some of you have an MFA. I don't have an MFA. So, I hope that we can learn from each other as the course goes by. As I do the lessons, I'm going to be referring to the opening chapter from my debut novel, Orphan Number 8. You don't have to buy this book. The opening chapter is available free online, and the link is available below this video and in our class. So you can read along with that. And what I decided to do was kind of share with you the different aspects of historical fiction using examples from that chapter, because then I can really explain like what went behind that decision or the research that informed that like detail. It's something I really like to do with historical fiction novels that I really admire, is kind of go to school on them. A colleague of mine, Neil Connolly, who's a great writer, he kind of gave me that expression, go to school on a novel. So a novel that really works for you as a reader, that you're like, wow, that was amazing. I loved that experience. I wish I could write that way. You can go to school on that novel and kind of deconstruct or reverse engineer, I suppose might be a good term. How did it achieve that effect? So that's kind of what we're going to do with the first chapter of Orphan Number 8. We'll go to school on it together, and I'll share with you what went into those decisions, what I was trying to accomplish. And then it's kind of for you to take what lesson applies to you and make it work for you. So this is not a class where I'm telling you how to really do things. I'm really sharing how I do things and why. And then you can kind of figure out how would you do that and why. Because as writers, so much of it is the decisions. A lot of people who are not writers imagine that what we do is think of something and then write the words down. And that is, of course, not what we're doing. We are figuring things out and solving problems all the time on many different levels. So all the levels end up working together, but for this class, I'm going to try to break them down into 4 key aspects of writing an effective scene in historical fiction. So in the first week, we're going to focus on world building. In the second week, we're going to look at how to develop characters and set them into that world. In the third week, we're going to look at populating that scene so that now we have our characters. How do they then interact with the world and move that scene, get the scene started? And in the fourth week, the idea of like bringing the whole scene to life, where we start to talk about like structure and plot and all those aspects of it. Of course, throughout everything, writing is just made out of words, and those words are yours, and the choices and the style, and that's something we're not going to delve too much into in this class. I get the impression that most of you have already really developed a writing style, and that you have a lot of experience in that area. But in the 5th week, when we workshop a scene that you've written, if that's something you're interested in getting feedback on, or we can respond to in a way that's helpful for you, we absolutely come to look at writing and style in the 5th week as we workshop. So a couple of key concepts for historical fiction I'll just share at the outset before we get started. As far as going to school on a novel, these are just 2 things I pulled off my bookshelf. Here's my old paperback copy of Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. I have read that many times, and I mostly read it to give myself the courage to write historical fiction, because Doctorow does so many really imaginative things in this novel, takes things from history and sets imaginary characters in those moments, and is kind of able to reimagine them, and is very free with his imagination. And that's something I like to read because it gives me that courage. What I do in my historical fiction, using a real historical incident or something that did happen, I develop a fictional story with fictional main characters. And in some ways, like, everything has a connection to something that really happened, but you could say the same thing about all contemporary fiction, about all fiction, really, science fiction. The world of the novel needs to be real in the novel. The fiction needs to feel real, because that's what enables the reader to let go of their sort of critical mind and really indulge in the storytelling and let you take them on this journey. Readers come to fiction because they're looking for that aesthetic experience. The world we live in, the lives we lead, are not structured in scenes. They don't necessarily have a plot. Things aren't foreshadowed. The conclusions aren't surprising yet inevitable, as we like to aim for in fiction often. So fiction, it's an aesthetic experience, and we're trusting someone has constructed this experience and is taking us on this journey. If someone's really interested in just the historical period, they can read history, they can read primary or secondary sources, and maybe they also do that. But they come to historical fiction primarily for the story. And maybe they favor historical fiction because they want to feel like they're learning something along the way. They're gaining an insight into a time, a place, a moment, a situation that they're interested in, but they want that to kind of come to them through the story. So Doctorow for me is a writer I go to school on. I was down at my bookshelf and I had to really restrain myself from picking up a lot of different books, but that's just one that really comes to mind for me. My personal project with historical fiction is to situate queer characters in a past from which our history is often erased or excluded or was hidden at the time. And I come back then to another book that was really influential for me as a young reader, The Persian Boy by Mary Renault. She writes, this is Alexander the Great time period, so very far in the past. The first historical novel where I encountered a queer protagonist. And it meant a lot to me at the time. If I went to my school library when I was in middle school or high school, nothing. If I worked in a library, actually, as my high school job, couldn't really find anything that gave me that sense of representation. And so, matter of fact, I was like, okay, here's my character, and this is what's happening. So that The Persian Boy by Mary Renault is an inspiration for me and a really early touchstone in sort of my personal connection with historical fiction, the project that I really focus on in writing my characters, some of my main characters. Another thing that I'll probably be mentioning as we go along in historical fiction, one of the things I have found most helpful is, in addition to reading about the time period, reading in the time period, reading things published in that time period. They give you a really different sense. They help you understand, if you're situating a character in that time and place, what was available to them in terms of their worldview. And of course, you can't, depending on what time and place you're talking about, that may not be as available to you. For me, writing early 20th century, mostly set in New York City, it's pretty easy for me to find things. So for an example, The Great Gatsby. We have read it in school, the symbolism of the green light and so forth. When you read it now, you're like, what a rip-roaring thriller. And that it was really popular. It's for me, it's written like in a popular way, but reading it helps me with some vocabulary and just the way we write about things. So, for instance, I don't know. You see how it is today. Maybe the iPhone is not introduced very many years ago, but we don't say, I take the electronic computer I carry in my pocket out and glance at it to see what the time application is telling me. It's just like, I check my phone for the time. And you see that when I read The Great Gatsby, it's just like, I called. It's not like I used this new invention called the telephone. So it's fun for me to read something in the period just to kind of get into the cadence of a certain kind of speech. Another thing that's really important, I think, in writing historical fiction is developing a true, diverse perspective on the time period. And that might be in terms of social position, class, access to power, gender, sexuality, identification, race, religion, whatever is really true in that period. The world is a very diverse place and the people in it are very diverse. And so you don't have to feel as if you're shoehorning anything in, to just lift your eyes a little bit. My main characters tend to be white Jewish women, middle class-ish, so not a huge stretch for me there. The sexuality of the characters that I write, some are gay, some are straight, some are figuring that out. That's something that I feel I can really speak to and feel connected with. But they live in a world that's more diverse than my own personal experience. And so in trying to populate that world, one of the things that I do, again, is I try to read in the period and not rely on the perceived images or notions that I may have gained through the education I received in American public schools. A book that I really loved in writing my second novel, Bachelor Girl, Black Manhattan, by James Weldon Johnson, published in 1930. I actually often order through, I use ABE books. I really love, if I can afford them, to find books that were published, not just written, but actually published at the time. This is the 1930 edition. And this gives me access to how did Black Manhattanites think of themselves, talk about their own history, look at the world from their point of view. So something like that, I really encourage when and if it's possible. As I mentioned, one of the things that I really focus on is diverse sexuality in my protagonists. So, for instance, a history book like Gay New York, very influential for me, again, in my second novel, Bachelor Girl. But in Orphan Number 8, one of the things that I found really helpful, this is a book published in the 1950s. How did American Medical Society discuss female lesbian sexuality in the 1950s? They wrote about it. People studied it. What would have been available to my character in how she was able to think about herself? So again, finding books written in the time as much as using books about the time. And one last thing that I'll pick up to show you, this is a book that I taught very often when I was teaching creative writing, Imaginative Writing by Janet Burroway. Many of the key concepts about writing, creative writing, that I will use will probably be echoed from my experience in using that textbook. So I just want to give her credit, and particularly for one or two key concepts with especially historical fiction that I learned from Janet Burroway. She's the one who talks about reading in the time period as much as you can. She also talks about allowing yourself to forget when you're doing your research. I tend to over-research for Orphan Number 8. My proportion of research to writing is ridiculous. I started it as a research project, as a family history research project, and that went on for years before I ever decided, okay, I need to try to write a novel. I'm trying to manage my proportion of research to fiction writing a little better, but I still get very overwhelmed with the research. I don't take very good notes. And that's something I kind of learned from Janet Burroway. She said, you have to let yourself forget because there's too much. A historical fiction novel is not a lecture on the historical period. And you really need to, after absorbing a lot, forget whatever doesn't really stick, because you are the one writing this novel. You are not impressing. It's not your PhD thesis. You don't have to go in front of a bunch of professors who all know more than you and who want you to show that you're an expert, and prove that you know everything that you're talking about, still say something original, and yet not be smarter than they are. I've defended a PhD thesis, and it's a very weird space to be in as a writer. The reader of historical fiction is not a professor necessarily of that historical period. You will make mistakes. You will make a mistake, at least one, probably more. Kate Quinn, who's a really great writer of historical fiction, she has a little section on her website about mistakes she's made. And I really appreciate that, because we're going to do it. And readers will notice, and you'll get a little email like, hey, on this page you said this, but it was really that. And you're like, thank you, for noticing and paying attention. That's really awesome. So as you write, you absorb a lot of research. Let yourself forget. Trust yourself that the things that are going to be important to you, to your mind, to you as a writer, to your story, will stick. And then if you need to check them, you're like, oh, wait, what exactly was that? You can check it. But for me, when I'm doing the research for historical fiction, I need to first research enough to have a sense of what story I can tell. And then I tend to outline the overall story I want to tell. And then as I'm writing that story, I'm learning what do I need to research a bit more about. Or I'm leaving a little XXX in the draft manuscript, like, okay, find that fact later, but just try to hit your word count for the day, which for me is always a huge challenge. Research is really important, but the reader is coming to you for a story. And so that's why in this class, we're going to focus on the idea of scene in historical fiction, because the scene is the aspect of creative writing that we are bringing to the reader. The history comes along with it, the characters come along, the setting, the story, but fiction, it's all about the scene. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this class. See you in the next video. Bye.